Okay, so we agreed the other day and to have kind of take sentences and try to represent them with our different formalisms. We all have tools, but my tools are not at the formalism level, but I've been working a lot with kind of modeling of formalisms. And I've been thinking about some of our use cases and what would I need to express those. And so I've been actually doing a lot of quick iterations on what I think are the components of formalism. Now, let me share screen. I don't have a model, a formal model yet. I mean, I do not have a UML model yet. It's text. But here's where I'm at. First, I'm thinking, what are the kinds of links I expect to see between entities? And here I expanded entities or predicates because it's a bit counterintuitive, but I'm realizing we're more and more doing kind of predicate calculus.
Question, like for an entity, you mean like the building blocks of a statement, like planets or whatever?
Yeah, climate change, person. I actually have, is this on this one or another one? Yeah, this is an example. I went through an example, right? Climate change is an existential threat. We can fight climate change through aerosols. Ocean acidification is part of climate change, is also an existential threat. Aerosols do nothing against ocean acidification. So we cannot say we can fight climate change through aerosols because of those other statements. Now, this makes a lot of assumptions about the same word being used in the same way in different sentences. And which is for me, actually, something I believe to be false. And being able to explicitly model when this is not the case is core for me. Being able to say that, we can say, we can refuse this, which is a way of saying that the climate change that is referred to here is not the same as the climate change in that is, I'm missing a sentence basically, but saying aerosols do nothing against climate change with the contradiction. Well, we're not using the same definition of climate change. If I had this too is false, is really saying we cannot find climate change through aerosols. And actually I should separate the support, like the non-to. Well, it's to contains its own negation, so that's fine. So I say none, I should say none to because blah, blah, blah. So that's the support statement, that's the argument. But basically the climate change in two and the climate change in the opposing statement, it's not a real negation because we're not using the same definition of climate change. That's what I'm trying to arrive at, with or without including ocean acidification, for example. So that's the kind of case I'm looking at, where disagreement hinges on a definition.
Can I ask you a question? Why wouldn't it just be simpler just to use a different term here if you mean something different by it, instead of using the same term?
That's absolutely true, but the problem is people don't. People use terms willy-nilly. And so any term, and that's my whole point, I keep hammering it over and over, any term is interpreted. And yes, when we are being careful, we can say, well, the interpretation of this sentence in this context is this more precise term. But that's the work of interpretation. But when sentences are given to us, they're vague. And you might say, okay, forget ocean acidification because it's a bit, maybe it's a bit stretched, but the reality is how much climate change, a lot of these things have threshold effects. They have degrees and thresholds. So do you mean from 1.5 degree, from 2.5 degree? What do you mean? And so on and so forth.
Right, but I guess you're saying that you don't want to change the sentence that is given to you to be more specific, so you want to store that information elsewhere. I just tend to think that that's going to be spaghetti. Is my guess.
What I'm saying is people will come and look for vague sentences. It is very important when people come with a vague sentence to tell them, listen, this sentence is meaningless as written. Here are more precise versions of it. So I totally believe in the necessity of showing them as soon as possible precisions. But the fact that they will, I don't think it is even useful to remove the vague sentence from the system and say, we only look at the precise sentence. Because the precise sentence, when you look at them, are paragraphs. And nobody will look for the paragraph. People enter knowledge through pith statements, which are vague. We use vague statements for economy.
So it sounds like maybe this is another situation where you need to have different interpretations, and then the claims would be related to one another.
That's exactly what I'm saying, yes.
Well, just a little clip on that. I mean, in some situations, you would want to rephrase the claim rather than denoting a term that's kind of hidden. Of course, you could also change the UI to where it would display some definition of the term. And then kind of comparing two dissimilar phrasings, one more specific, one less specific. I guess what I'm saying is my preference is also to keep the common ambiguous phrasings but link them to more specific phrasings rather than defining a term.
The specification can be done at the claim level, can be done at the term level. Both are good. I would tend to do it at the term level as much as possible because it enables better analysis when you're seeing this term is used in this claim and that claim, and does it correspond, does it match, is it meaningful to see those two claims one with the other? Well, it depends if the claim's interpretation is the same.
Yeah, so I would still do both. I would have the terms linked, but I would still, devagify.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Okay.
What I'm hoping is that at some point we'll be able to derive the relationship between claims in some cases from the relationship between terms. Like if we're able to say, in this claim where there's this term which has these interpretations, then we automatically induce, well, hence there's these interpretations on the claim, which are, I'm not saying in all cases, right? There are claims where such analysis will not necessarily work, but I'm saying where possible, if we can derive claim interpretation from term interpretation, it's more economical to do so.
And I guess also in the UI, if you know what the term is, you could replace the simple word with the longer word in specific cases.
Yeah. But what I'm absolutely adamant about is the vague term needs to be in the system, because this is how people will approach the system. They'll come with the vague claim, vague term, and they have to find it and then be told, this doesn't mean much. Let's look at what it means in context. So that's my general approach to the whole thing. But the notion that definitions change, definitions are contextual, is for me a key thing. So what I was busy saying before I got into this, which is true for me, this is kind of a motivating case. The fact that we have definition drift between sentences. if I look at predicates or entities, and here I'm equating both, that's not obvious at all, but I'm realizing it is possible to treat predicate and entities kind of together, because an entity, we don't manipulate entities, we manipulate entities through their names. And a name is a unique predicate. It's a predicate with a condition of uniqueness. There's a unique X that satisfies being called by this name. And I'm kind of here equating predicate with their range. If I have, blue things, well, there's a collection of blue things. If I have, Marc-Antoine Parent now, of course, there's a bunch of Marc-Antoine Parent, as it turns out, but, born at this date, blah, blah, blah. If there's enough information to uniquely specify me, there's a predicate that is narrow enough that we can claim this is a unique entity. Why am I doing this? It's because, I was speaking a lot about set theoretic. Is there overlap? Is there symmetric difference? Is there disjointness? Set theoretic operations. Well, I realized that these can be applied to predicates by induction on their range. I can say this predicate is a subset of this other predicate because its range is a subset. This predicate is, there's something that fits this predicate and not this, because again, there's an element, there's something in the symmetric difference. So there's a lot of set theoretic machinery we can apply to predicates that way, which I think is quite great in terms of generality. So when we have links between predicates, we have basically this subclass / element, and I'm kind of even hand waving the notion of element here, because we have unique predicates. Part of, which I don't think we'll use much. Grading predicate. Now that's really interesting. I realized besides the some predicates have fuzzy belonging, and the person is bald, well, more or less bald, or more or less hairy. And is there a threshold? Not necessarily, but you can do comparison, and comparisons are extremely important. I mean, temporal succession is a case of comparison. Deontic comparison, like we should do this instead of that. That's a comparison. So I'm not sure there's always a number with grading predicates, but the idea that a predicate is a basis of comparison. So that's a relationship between claims and between predicates. Or a claim can be a relationship between predicates. Scope provenance, I'm still working on this one, but it's, I think, what Tim called context up to a point, saying we observed this in this context. This claim was true in this context, at this time, at this location, at whatever. So this is a relationship between claims. Analogy still requires work also. So these are links between predicates, and then we have links between claims. A claim is built of predicates. It's saying this predicate is true, possible, question, likely, and so on. Here I'm saying claims allow quantifiers and modality, and I'm hand waving a lot, but the idea that this is always true, this is sometimes true, this is blah, blah, blah. And then you can, once you have quantifiers and modality, you can start doing relations. So this claim situation causes claim. It's done it in the past. Here's an instance. It does it sometimes, more or less likely, always, never, positive feedback loop, negative feedback loop. Those are kind of higher level kinds of cause. As I said, causal, epistemic, and interpretation. I'm now putting interpretation as a major thing. And this probably goes up, by the way. I'm beginning to think it applies also to predicates, not just link between claims. And this is interpretation. It's interesting because it's a kind of subcase, but it's a subcase linked to no, please. It's a subcase of subcase, but with an interpretant, which may be specified or not. I know Tim doesn't want to specify interpreters, and that's perfectly fine. But I do think that knowing somebody has interpreted this as that, even unspecified person, is important to this ability to speak about scoping. So the idea is we have these vague predicates, and then we look at what are concrete things that have happened, what are concrete things that are expected to happen, and the feasibility fits there actually. It doesn't apply to this case. It doesn't, if this is true, this generic claim is false. And then we need to narrow our general claim to say, well, not in this case, not in this case, not in this case, in a more precise interpretation. And often yeah.
Isn't what you just described the counter argument? Like if this is true, then this is false?
Exceptions are not exactly, yes, okay. And this is where it gets interesting. I think that exceptions are not the same as counter arguments. Like it's a counter argument to the universality of the claim, but it's not a counter argument to the claim seen in a probabilistic fashion. Like if we're saying, I think this is true in general, and then you can have, it's absolutely true in this case, and I'm not sure about generality. And then you start giving counter examples, then it shows kind of restrictions on the scope of applicability of this claim. And we can say, okay, it's definitely not true in those cases, definitely true in those cases. We're still trying to carve out exactly the domain of truth of this general claim, but you haven't invalidated the fact that it exists as a general claim. You've just invalidated domains of applicability. And yes, that means it's false as an absolute truth. Yes, that way it is. But it doesn't mean that you've totally collapsed it as a truth with some scope.
Also, like that's the most simple case of that is when you say all people do this. Well, I know my uncle doesn't do that. Okay, actually, I meant most people do this, right? And then to argue against that, you got to prove. Well, first of all, you need to quantify most, right?
Right.
But then you need to prove a percentage or something. But yeah.
Yeah. And it's the classic typicality arguments, right? Birds fly, except quite a few of them.
Right.
Penguins, ostriches, and the like.
But that goes into like my view on context, which you would have, you could say all birds fly. Well, that's not true, but then you could say, then you go down from birds into the taxonomy, the more specific groups of species, and say all of this species fly. Oh yeah, okay, like that kingdom or whatever. But anyway.
And it's still true that birds as a clade we're defining by either flying or once flying, right? Flying at some point in their ancestral tree. It's what they derive their characteristics, their physiological characteristics from flight having happened at the origin of the clade. And it's still a fundamental truth about birds, that flying is part of their physiological makeup, even if quite a few birds don't fly.
Right, and that brings up the again, the definitions where, you can make it true just by changing the definition. That's often what biologists do, is like rename the categories. And then, to maintain the history, because people said this is true or isn't true and agree with that, you have to maintain the definition as of whatever point, and then actually this is a new claim based on a new definition using the same words.
Right. Yeah, the history of mammals and echidnia is absolutely platypus and so on is extremely relevant here, right? Mammals are characterized by, well, placenta and milk production, and then suddenly, whoops, placenta doesn't always hold, or egg laying, or whatever. Okay, we'll stick to egg production. And there's something a bit arbitrary, sorry, to milk production. There's something a bit arbitrary. We could have gone the other way and put echidnia and monotremes in a category of their own and not call them mammal. We could have, we didn't. It's names. So yeah, so what I'm trying to do is saying, so this is a very specific interpretation as a subcase of subcase is a very different kind of interpretation. Scoping is not about subcase, it's a relationship between, okay, I'm still not happy with this relationship between claims, saying this claim was observed in this context. So context defined as predicates and claims, not sure about that. But I'm quite sure that by making interpretation as a kind of first class, even if it's a subcase, class of link, I'm gaining something for analysis of something like this. And making subcase a specific thing is part of, as I said, I don't think we'll use more. And, you know, causality evidence as the two main kinds of argument. The feasibility, as I said, does it apply to cause, effect, blah, blah, blah. Making the notion of graded predicates fundamental, I'm quite happy with, because a lot of class predicates are defined as a gradation, and we're arguing about thresholds all the time. And being able to say this falls, this is more than this, without thinking about does it fall in the class, outside class, where we're not arguing about threshold, we're arguing about relative. And this is extremely important when we're doing the deontic comparisons, which we're doing all the time. And there's another thing, which is then we get into things such as transference, right? A causes B, B is bad, so we can say A is bad. Bad here being the notion of a graded predicate. Deontic bad transference. You know, the end does not justify the means. This is an inference scheme. This is not a given, but it's a trope, and it's saying we have the causal link, we have the grading predicate, which is a link between claims or situations or entities. And it turns out that certain grading relationships are transmitted across causal link or not. I mean, people argue about this all the time. Does the end justify the means? Certainly, you can evaluate an effect by its causes, but can you evaluate? And then you can get into questions of intention. I didn't get into intention. That may be interesting in certain contexts. Yeah, I will add just and something I'm thinking about is also the question of stance. Do I want to introduce a notion of stance in there somewhere, but which could be a kind of grading predicate. But I think those are kind of fundamental building blocks. And when we start applying them to reasonings like this one, I expect to use those building blocks in making the argument about why we are doing this. Now, I don't know what's, and I'd be interested to compare with the building blocks you're using. But do you think I'm missing something fundamental? Is there something you think you can clarify, and so on? Or should we try applying it together to the cases we know? That would be my next step if I don't have more comments.
I think that might make sense. I think your scope is like way bigger than everyone else's.
That's a given.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any additional requirements.
The only thing that I would add, Marc-Antoine,
Yeah.
I think you mentioned the, like vague terms and then more specific terms in context. And the only thing that I would add to that is a society library priority. And we are already able to do a debate map is having additional variant phrasing categories, like things that contain technical jargon or not, and different reading levels and that sort of thing. I don't know if you're interested in that, but that's something that's important to the society library data architecture. As an educational entity, we need to opt into like different educational levels and levels of familiarity with the subject matter, which would mean the swapping of terms for like jargon or essentially the definitions of jargon and stuff like that.
Right. Okay, so there's two aspects to this. One is if they're equivalent, it's symmetric subcasing, right? But there's also the question of saying this is more obscure than. So that's actually interesting. Oops, what happened here? Sorry, I'm fighting with my keyboard. I'm trying to do an N and I'm getting this. Oh, it seems to be in the keypad, maybe. Yes. Intelligibility as a grading predicate. More on the symbol. And that's interesting because a lot of these were about the referent rather than the symbol itself. And this is about the symbol. So I'll think about that one. Is the predicate acting on the symbol or on the referent?
So, but I think you did mention that use case was actually, well, equivalent statements. Do you think it'd be useful to have a tagging or some sort of way to say the purpose for these equivalent statements, like Jamie was saying with, maybe it's at a certain grade level, or would that be an intelligibility of symbol? What would you say?
Yeah, the maybe intelligibility is not good enough because it supposes a linear-ish scale, whereas what is more interesting.
And when you say symbol in that case, you're talking about the whole string of characters as
the string as opposed to what it refers to, the Peircean distinction between the symbol and the reference.
Yeah, I just think of a symbol as a single symbol rather than a string of symbols, like a
yeah. Symbol as a word is a symbol, a phrase is a symbol.
Okay.
Sorry. Peircean semantics. But okay, so maybe it's not a grading predicate. Maybe it's something else. So I'll.
But you're comfortable with adding something to kind of let us tag that sort of.
Oh yeah. I mean,
sounds great.
Listen, my aim is maximality. If there's a need, I want to include it. The question is this plus this answering the need? And that's what I want to check.
Looks like to me.
Jamie.
I'll see if Jamie thinks.
Sorry, what was that?
Is equivalence plus intelligibility and maybe with respect to community, is that enough?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, good. That covers your need. But thank you. That's definitely a good call. And this one I'll think hard about because, as I said, all the other predicates were about the referent, not about the symbol. And this one is interesting. I'll have to.
Yeah, it's like kind of like a new class for you there.
Yeah, it is a new class. I think, you know what?
I mean,
You become.
what worries me is that like this becomes an explosion of complexity, unless you know keep
Well,
it
we're
to
doing
a separate
top-down,
domain or
so-
something. Yeah, I mean, well, so how do you determine intelligibility? Is that debatable?
Oh,
Are
on
we
that.
going to have debates
Oh
about
God.
which category each phrase goes
Of course.
into? Of course, exactly. That's Marc Antoine's response. Of course, and
Curation
I'm like,
solves so many
no.
problems. Ugh, guys, curation solves so many
Well,
Well,
problems.
exactly, but so does centralization, and
Yeah,
part of
exactly.
the design goal here is to decentralize.
Yeah, no, exactly. So curation is saying you're allowed to have a dictator, and that's definitely something I'm trying to avoid. The question is, how can we crowdsource intelligibility? Tim is right to ask the question. How can we? And that's easy to crowdsource, as it turns out. It's easy to say, well, this one, so many people say they're having trouble with that term or that notion. This is understood by so many people in this community, and it's easy to. This one is exceptionally statistically treatable, as opposed to curation in this case.
One quick thing I wanted to add when we're talking about what's debatable and what's not. I was thinking the other day that rather than building a separate feature in the system to say that this feature is debatable and this feature is not, one other way to do it is if you have a message-based system, which I know Marc Antoine prefers, you could simply have it to where you can debate anything that happened within the history of the messages.
Yeah.
And then almost any feature you have automatically is debatable.
Yeah. My basic stance is everything is debatable. Now, of course, there are structural constraints, but the structural constraints are, as I see it, a kind of upper layer ontology, not at the base layer, because we'll have to even debate the structural constraints. But some of them are kind of like negation is pretty fundamental, but negation, here what I'm showing is negation is dependent on interpretation and the whole, how do you define things? And there's this notion of referential transparency that we know what we mean by the word, which is an anti-assumption for me. And a lot of seeming negation ends up being violation of referential transparency. And I'm being, this term used in this context was interpreted this way, but used in that context, it was interpreted that way. And when you look at the term naked, decontextualized, then you have to say, well, sometimes the interpretation is this, sometimes the interpretation is that, and which one do you mean? Because it might matter or not, depending on your context. And usually we'll look for the maximal meaning, and sometimes we'll look for the restraint that's applicable to this context, to this claim, to the specific claim or argument. When you speak of complexity, I mean, it's true that if you're allowed to discuss things, it adds a layer. On the other hand, I think not being able to allow it means that it will happen outside and the system did not capture it, and it hides the complexity. I believe the complexity is there. You can either tackle it or close your eyes to it, in my opinion. I mean, that's me.
Or tackle
okay,
it
so
with closed eyes. Sorry.
What?
Tackle it with closed eyes.
Yes, exactly. Let's model a specific sentence. And actually, let's go through the exercise. I mean, let's take Tim's base sentence, because I think it's a good one. Economic cost of lockdown exceeds human mortality cost. should I do it, or Tim, do you want to do it the way you expect to do it first?
I mean, I could see how it would. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you're thinking. I see this as being essentially a multi-premise structure. Well, first of all, I see it as being a comparison claim, right? So you have, it's one of those where you don't just have a negation, you also have 3 mutually exclusive claims, right? That's the first step, is you have economic cost of lockdown exceeds, you have equals, and you have is less than, right?
Yeah. Triadic exceeds relation. Yeah, so this is almost why I introduced these triadic relations, like these grading predicates. So I'm saying cost would be, but now in this case, it's a bit more subtle. It's not just a grading predicate, it's a grading predicate with an equivalence relation. So what I would tend to say is we have lockdown predicate. We have
just parenthetically, this triadic, as you've called it, there are 3 claims, each of which has a negation.
Yeah.
The less than is
Greater
not the
or equal.
negation of greater than, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Greater or equal. Yep. I'm a bit tempted to ignore the equality here because it's razor thin. Though there is certainly a non-razor thin, comparable, equivalent, close enough.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's razor
No, you're
thin.
right. Yeah,
because
you're right.
we have the error bars, right?
Yeah. No, you're
They're
right.
both approximations. So,
and there's certainly a whole range where you would say they're comparable. Or
it's like, yeah, we won't use those then. What else you got for us to make our decision on, right?
Yeah.
You know.
Okay, fair enough. So ordered relation. Well, this is basically an ordered relation, right? You have compare equivalent, greater than, lesser than. It's not it's an ordering. I think it's even a well-ordered relation because, yeah, it is a well-ordered relations. Well-ordered meaning that any 2 points are comparable. There's no incomparable points. So lockdown's a big predicate. There's an implicit predicted lockdown, which is a subcase of lockdown. And same with, and there's a cost of, actually, cost of 2. That's, how did I call it again? Grading predicate. Yeah. Here I'm tempted to not do the same role because of course there's a predicted mortality as opposed to, yeah, let me simplify in this case because obviously there has to be a predicted mortality. There's cost this is what I said, is less than other entity. I'm realizing, I mean, basically what you do with an ordering relation, right? So this is how I would decompose the that sounds right. And what I'm happy to say is I've been able to decompose this using pretty much the building blocks I had given myself. A grading predicate, the equivalence factor is another grading predicate. This is a predicate. Now here, the notion of with error bars is maybe an addition to my scheme. I'm not sure I had the notion of error bars here.
Yeah, and I don't know, because in the end, we're not trying to calculate, or I'm not trying to calculate agreement. I'm trying to show what it looks like you agree with, but you can override and say I agree with this. Means even if the error bars aren't built in there, you can see that, oh yeah, actually it's true that the cost is a little higher or a little lower or whatever, but I agree that they're about the same. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. Doing calculations is a different scope, totally. But being able to express somehow that this is an approximate calculation, I think is being able to say this is a hand-wavy calculation is in scope, as opposed to a precise mathematical thing. So here I'm a bit, I don't think we want to. The fact that they exist, I want to kind of build into the assertion of comparison status. And you know, the fact that, you know, they're likely to correspond with overlap, without overlap, they're totally disjoint, the two costs are here or they're here, and these are things I want to be able to say in a comparison predicate about like a predicate that is linking two claims, my higher order predicates, of which the list was there. Let's look at maybe another example. But here's what really important is the notion that there's an implicit thing which is left unspecified, but we know is more precise than just lockdown. What do we mean by lockdown? Well, the person's making that statement probably has a more precise idea of what the lockdown would entail to make such a statement. Possibly, hopefully. And having the conversation in a meaningful way requires being a bit more precise about, okay, what kind of lockdown are you considering? And how much mortality are you expecting? And so on and so forth.
But so, there's a structure here that is multi-premise. There's another structure here that is the parameterized claim, right? Essentially, you would expect to support the claim or oppose it by saying the economic cost of the lockdown will be X, and the human mortality cost of the lockdown will be Y.
Yep.
So, and what's interesting is those arguments neither support nor oppose, but do one or the other depending on their relationship to each other.
Right. So what
yeah.
If I want to oppose this, and that's a very good question. That's the next step. You're absolutely right. So objection. According to lockdown plan X, cost CX, and estimate mortality estimate Y, equivalent cost CY, we have CY much greater than CX. Autocorrect is killing me. So, and what is important is 7. This is decomposable in all those things. Let me call this 0. Claim 7 is more specific than 0, and or rather is a more specific form of non-zero. It's more specific than the negation of 0.
I don't know if people find this useful because scoring is out of scope. But the interesting thing about scoring is that generally what you would do is you'd have a pro claim that says this is the cost, and you'd have a con saying this is the benefit, and then the score would then result.
Did I speak about scoring at any point?
No, that's what I'm saying. No, but I'm saying that this same decision process of saying that you have these two things and determining and saying these are the different values, it could be represented differently if you have a scoring system, and you wouldn't need a structure in your data model to handle it because it would be handled in the scoring. And so that's kind of an aside, but when we talk about modeling all this.
Okay,
it would have to be structure.
I'm not sure.
I kind of miss a little bit of that.
Yeah, sorry.
The scoring structure would take care of what?
So when you're comparing these two things, the way you do it in a scoring system is you'd have one of them as a pro, one as a con, and then depending upon the score, if the score is positive, then it would be, it would be saying that that it reached the positive, that it's agreeing with one.
They're interdependent. It's not that one is a pro and one is a con. They're two interdependent.
If you have a scoring system, the interdependency is handled by the scoring system.
Right, but it needs to be a scoring system designed specifically for this structure.
No, I'm saying the standard scoring system handles it.
I
the reason scoring system handles it by default is what I'm saying, is that you don't need a separate structure.
One question.
But
does your score separate, for example, probability and desirability? I may say.
Not explicitly.
Yeah,
it can be modeled in it rather clearly.
I think separating those are important personally.
I'm not saying it's a completely equivalent thing. I'm just saying it's interesting
let me explain, or let me try to get at why I kind of disagree with. I mean, we might be saying the same thing, but when you're saying scoring system. I'm looking at the current scoring systems, which is basically an argument that supports can do no harm, and an argument that opposes can do no good, right? Its lowest score is 0, which doesn't move the needle. You can't have an argument in support of something that ends up opposing the thing. Like if it's totally wrong, it's totally wrong. And then so wait, let me get to the point where you have here the cost of the lockdown is $1 trillion and the cost to lives is $10 trillion, right? So you have the cost of the lockdown as a pro and the cost of the lives as a con. And if you agree with both claims that it's 1 trillion and it's 10 trillion, then if you're not talking about relevance, what you've done is evened it out 50-50 in terms of the scoring, because yes, it's true and fully relevant that it's 1 trillion, and it's true and fully relevant that it's 10 trillion in lives, and I've got a 50-50 based on our current opposed or support structure, right? Because they're both equally relevant and true. Now, how do you get it to the point that, yeah, but the 1 trillion, I guess you have to attack the 1 trillion is not relevant because it doesn't surpass the 10 trillion
or
of
less
lives.
relevant.
Right, but now apply that to the plethora, the parameterization of all the arguments where, and you're going to have the opposite. You're going to have people making no. The point is, what you'll have is an explosion of arguments for and against relevance because of some other, like if you have 5 here, it's 1 trillion, 10 trillion, 1 billion, 100 billion, and the same on the other side. Then somebody's going to agree with this and say this one is irrelevant because of this, and somebody's going to say this one's irrelevant because of this, and this one's irrelevant because of that. But no, this one's relevant, right? You get a cardinality problem.
Well, no, but and this is exactly why I want to decompose. I mean, I'm not sure how we got onto scoring, to be honest, and I almost don't see the point, but I'm trying to think at what the point is. Right now, I was just saying, this is a valid counter-argument to that because it's arguing for a more specific subcase of a negation. Now, somebody who disagrees with this could disagree on kind of any of the points of the decomposition. You can disagree on the equivalence factor, you can disagree on the estimate, you can disagree on thousands of things, right? And then you'd come up with a different x prime, cx prime, and say, well, this is also a subcase of 0 or of not 0. And oh Lord, let's see. Thank you for that information, James. Then we can get into the disagreement between the more specific things, which is more useful, I think. But to fight the combinatorics Tim was speaking about, we can disagree about each point separately. What is the equivalence factor? What is the estimate? What is this? What is that? And those are more contained discussion. And then we can say, okay, given this equivalence factor, this estimate, blah, 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 we can have these, we can now argue about these things. And a lot of the relationships between the composite claims can devolve into relationship between the terms claim, equivalence factor, prediction, blah, blah, and so on, lockdown plan. And we can say, well, I think this lockdown plan's cost is higher or lower, this specific plan. And we can disagree about the estimated cost of that plan. And so, but arguing about these things separately, I think precisely reduces the combinatorics. That's the whole point. Can we derive the relationship between 2 points from the relationship between the components? And I think in general, not in general, in many cases, yes. In general, I'm not sure, but in many cases, yes. Dead silence. And between, however, I do see that then scoring is important, but I would say the scoring will be more useful when applied to the components, because it'll make it easier to decompose the argument between the components, which is easier to score because we're on a linear scale instead of multivariate. And then that makes, again, that allows to reduce the combinatorial.
Yes.
Okay. It is time. There's silence. I think we should continue this process with more examples, but maybe not today. Unless, I don't know, I'm trying to interpret the silence. Any round of comments, please?
In general, for me, I've never been that deep. And yeah, it makes sense, but I have nothing to add. That's from my side, yeah.
Okay.
And I think Marc-Antoine, you and I are in agreement on this, so that's why I'm not adding anything.
Good. I wasn't sure.
Well, on this thing about this structure, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of details in there that when we dive down, we'll find plenty to disagree on, but yeah.
One thing I'm curious to discuss further with you, because I'm really struggling with it, is you used context to mean definition, and I was opposing that, but is there a real distinction between what I call context, which is more definition scope, and definition? Is that a real difference, or what I'm imagining? I'm still trying to be more precise about that, and that's something I want to dig into eventually.
Yeah, that can be a separate conversation. I mean,
I think so.
To me, context is functional definition, essentially. It's definitions with relationships and some functions to it, basically.
Maybe James, do you want to say something about your invitation to that session today?
Oh, well, first I'd like to apologize for interrupting the conversation. I didn't quite realize that was going to be interrupting the speaker, so I felt a little bad about that. Yeah, I think that thank you for the invitation to say something about it. So you probably all know I got funded recently by this guy, Nick Marks, and he has a Discord. I'm sure you've all been invited to it. Anyway, he wants to set up an open collective, and the idea of, is still kind of taking shape what it's going to turn out to be. Stephen Juris, unfortunately, won't be able to be there, although he's expressed a lot of interest in it. I think the idea might be something along the lines of creating a system that's like good enough already based on some of the discussions that have been had about the use cases or, the models. There was a model that Tim shared with me already. So anyway, just to create a system and do more of a lean startup thing where we find a community to serve and then we see what they really need and then iterate the system based on that. I think, I feel a lot of stress around disinformation and the destabilization of society. So I'm feeling, I really, really respect the work that's being done here as in terms of creating a really complete system that's going to be, having the most longevity possible. But for me, like, I want to create a system that can create some meaningful connection and shared reality between people who disagree with each other. around things that are really destabilizing our world. So that's kind of the, the focus of it. I think it's going to be a helpful addition to the process, and would love to have anybody participate who wants to.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And just so you know, a little feedback about why the silence, like I apologize, I was distracted, but a lot of this goes over my head, and I'm hoping to, have it soak in through osmosis, but so I don't think I have too much to add most of the time.
I think I have to watch my own jargon level, as Jamie would say.
Yeah, we need different versions, variant phrases of everything you say that we can opt into so we understand.
Yeah, immediately translated in real time.
Exactly. Yeah, we need little toggles on our Marc Antoine, and we can toggle back and forth from jargon whenever we're comfortable, because we need to optimize for comprehension.
So is that to be your parting comment?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Except I'll see you later today also.
That's true. No, I'm question. How I am too jargony, fair enough, but I know you've thought about these issues a lot, Jamie. So I'm curious, was the jargon making it difficult for you to follow? Because I know you've tackled these very issues.
Yeah, it's not really difficult for me to follow. Okay. I will be honest, I am multitasking. So like when things prick up in my ears, I like unmute and I'm like, hey, what about this? Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm almost all my meetings, I have to multitask. So I'm being a jerk, but I don't, of everything that I've heard, it's not over my head. And we agree on many things as well, except for essentially the how. Like, how do you go about structuring something so that you can have these data models? Like, we cut so many corners due to curation, and we won't really face these problems until the curation turns into a hard-coded distributed analysis end-to-end information processing pipeline, which we don't have to worry about until we've really done enough curation to know, like the really deeply hard-coded micro task system. So yeah, so a lot of the issues that you guys are discussing are about how to accomplish this in a way that I won't be dedicating a lot of thought to at this time, because I've only found success in doing hands-on stuff. And so once we've done enough hands-on stuff to figure out, okay, how can we start from the ingestion of media to delivering our intended output with a larger and larger and larger group of people, can we then break down all the tasks and decentralize it? So we're not there yet. And so I don't want to ideate and contribute when I don't have the experience to inform those ideas.
Fair enough. I do have a slight pushback. We did speak about, I did say everything's a claim, and that's a matter of distributed versus curation. But I do think that everything in this model applies independently of the curation versus distributed aspect, in the sense that even a curated central system has to worry about listing interpretations of a sentence. And that's something I think you're dealing with, and saying as I said, without maybe worrying about who interprets, because Tim definitely doesn't want to go there, and I'm not sure you do. But even then, the notion that this sentence is interpreted in many ways, and that this is the source of disagreement about, for example, the causal structure, which is in scope for you, as far as I know. I'm a bit, I'm not sure this is anything I said is distinguished on the curation, non-curation aspect, except saying, oh, some of those things are debatable.
Yes. I mean, I would think that in a crowdsourced system, I mean, you do have to worry about how the consensus around this variant or that variant, or what is the standards for how we're going to create these variations of phrasings, is going to be determined, right? So for the Society Library at this stage, we lean very, very heavily on the training that we provide people. And then there's so many passes, like editorial passes, where you would go through. So we really haven't yet formalized, okay, at what threshold would this be considered like the jargony version versus like a different version. So it's much more soft and informal, and it needs to formalize in order to become, hard-coded in a distributed content analysis process. But these are things that we'll discover as like the work gets done. Right now, it's very, very informal negotiations. But to me, like doing it that way is important to learning those parameters.
Yeah, I don't think you got what I said. I'm saying totally independent of that. Being able to record the fact that there's a disagreement in the structure is needed anyway, no matter what system you use or don't use to resolve it, you still need to record it.
Yes. Yes.
So that way, I don't think there's much that I said today that was about the process. It's about how do I describe the discrepancy? How do I record the discrepancy?
Well, then I should have been paying more attention, because then I would have more to say.
Well, yeah, but you're also explicitly describing it through the model of the system. And I think what some of us are doing in the meantime is describing it either external to the system or in the system in text, or leaving some of that out in our presentation.
Yeah,
so,
that's it.
Yeah, I mean, we eventually want to get there, but I think a lot of the detail level that you're getting down to, isn't necessary for Jamie and I and James's stuff.
That's what I'm kind of contesting. I'm saying you will run into these things because they are part of the argumentation itself.
And you're saying there isn't a workaround?
Correct.
Like I can't rephrase the sentence in some way because she already has multiple.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is once you've rephrased the sentence, you're putting words in people's mouths. This is not what they said. I'm saying that the fact is the argument exists because of the vagueness. And if you want to represent the fact that people are arguing about this,
but if I put in their vague sentence and tell them, here's two other sentences, which one do you mean? Without building a system around that, then right. So what I'm saying is that we're going to hit some things, and some of the things we'll choose to just not tackle, and that's a curation decision. And the other ones we're going to have a workaround, and we want to have your system, but we just may not have the brain power at the moment to fully absorb your system and give you adequate feedback, because we're also trying to figure out the workarounds in life.
Yeah.
And I will say, Marc-Antoine, I think you're already familiar with this too, that the Society Library does have a record keeping system of who is deriving what from where, and to what extent has that changed from its original iteration. So we do have that, right? It's like, where did this claim come from? Was it derived? Was it implied? Was it implicit? Which, suggests the level of how much the sentence structure had to change in order to be represented in debate map. And then the name associated with, like, okay, who did that? Who made that edit? So there's like soft, squishy record keeping. And we know that has to be increasingly formalized because we want it to be, with like redundant and, intercoder reliability, and there to be a consensus mechanism. But that's all in the distributed content analysis, which is, the mechanics of that have been worked out by the social sciences for content analysis. And we just don't have the money to build that system yet, but we already have soft records. They're just outside of debate map currently.
Yeah. Now, what I'm saying, Bentley, is that a lot of what you're trying to push out of the system, and I understand why you want to do it because it's complex and we want to reduce complexity. That is, as Stephen often says, the job of software engineers is to reduce complexity. But I'm saying a lot of what you want to push out ends up being an actual stake in an actual debate when you look at actual debates. Rarely, more and more rarely, and as you go up the abstraction ladder, but does happen.
Well, let me clarify. I don't want to push it out. I'm just deferring.
Punting.
Until I have the time
punting
to,
is valid.
Yeah. No, everything that you've said, I want that system and I want it yesterday.
Got it. Gotcha.
So I don't have any fundamental disagreements with
Got it.
where you're going in the path. I I am slow at it because some of those terms, it's been 20 years since I had them in high school math, and I didn't even take trig. So you know, well, yeah, I think I failed trig or calculus. I can't remember what. So you know, it's a little slow up here.
No. And by the way, one thing I'm struggling with is, you know, how to make that intelligible to people who don't have the kind of math and logic training I have. It's a problem.
Yeah, I don't know that it would be worth your time, because for you to explain or to rewrite a sentence that has the word transitive to say what transitive means in every sentence that you have would blow up your text and make it so long that people
only
I've been thinking about that, but
only once probably, because all these words usually have a simple concept, and if you have no idea what's behind it, then you cannot understand the sentence it contains. But if you have a vague idea, like by a short description that goes with it, then you can think about it, and if you have further questions, ask. So,
and I'm also wondering,
and then you know the concept, like transitive, for example, only needs to be explained once, and once you understood it, it doesn't need to be explained anymore.
Yeah, and I don't think that the end user will have to understand transitivity. Hopefully not. We, between us, yes. So yes, Felix's point remains relevant. But for example, the notion of this is a subcase of that, this is a ordering predicate. I don't think we want to use those words because that's going to be, but we have to get the notion that this is a relation by which we're comparing things. We're comparing things through that filter, through that lens, and what's the right either word, language, or visual metaphor, or whatever, right? But there's an axis, things are ordered on that axis. And there's many axes, and they can be ordered differently on different axes. That's important. And for example, saying, well, if the whole deontic transmitted through causality, I mean, people know instinctively when you say, well, if this has bad consequences, it's probably a bad idea. You don't, that's hard, that's not hard to understand. But the way I put it,
deontic's not a word that I have run across in my life.
It's the philosophical jargon for should.
I need
good and bad.
There's a couple terms I've been meaning to Google, and I just haven't gotten around to it. But you know, from context, I infer that, but I also might be getting things wrong. Like when you're using predicate, I can think of predicate and subject, object, predicate in a sentence, and I think you're using it in a slightly different.
Yeah, I'm using it in the sense of predicate calculus. P of x, is P of x true or false?
Yeah.
Given for a given x.
It's a
function with the truth value.
Right. Even though I'm familiar with the word, I was not familiar with the definition.
And the range of the predicate is all x's for which P of x is true. That's what I meant by range of the predicate. Good point.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm able to parse it. It's just slowly.
I understand.
We might want to encourage a bit more, like if you don't understand the word, to actually interrupt and ask for that word, because usually, please do it. It helps everyone, I think.
Yeah, and this one is really not like, this is a good example. I could define it in 2 sentences.
I feel comfortable in interrupting, as y'all know. It's just those I've been able to understand through context. I didn't feel as important enough, but
Zoom
an
has
invite
this,
to everyone.
Maybe we use some Zoom reactions. The hand raise, for example. So it's not, you don't have to interrupt someone while they're speaking, but like have something more subtle.
Yep.
And James, same thing. I mean, sorry if I'm going over.
It's not a problem at all. Yeah, it's I'm just newer, to the game this time around. I've only been a handful of meetings, so I'm getting caught up, and I don't want to interrupt to.
But I am.
expect
But you
everyone
see,
to
you're
wait
not the
while I
only
get
one
caught
with
up.
those problems. That's the reality. I mean, I am jargony. It's a flaw I
I get
have.
that. Well, I think, yeah, we'll find our way through it. It's fine.
Okay,
Not a
I
major
think
hurdle.
this is a good time to stop. And I don't think I'll be able to go to the Discord, by the way, because I do realize I have another meeting half hour later. So, oh no, it's 12:30. It's in an hour. Yeah, maybe I could come.
Hour, 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, and James, is that going to be recorded?
Yeah, I think so. Yep.
Because I might not be able to make it today. I got too much going on.
Yeah, same for me.
All right.
Okay.
Sorry.
Have a
We'll
good
go
day.
See you
in
next
the meeting.
time.
See you next time. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.